Right now in Montreal, where city workers are now removing a statue of Canada's first Prime Minister that was pulled down yesterday by activists. The statue of Sir John A. Macdonald in Place du Canada was toppled following a march that was calling for the defunding of police. A handful of people climbing the monument, tying ropes around the statue, and holding up a banner before unbolting the statue and pulling it down. It hit the ground and the head flew off. It is not clear if those who toppled the statue were in fact affiliated with the march. Concerns about the impact of Macdonald's policies have made statues of him targets in cities right across this country. For more, let's bring in Natalie Collada.
We can tell you, as you mentioned, the cleanup efforts today are underway this morning with crews removing the barricades around the toppled statue, as well as a big crane truck lifting up there you can see it there, the statue of Canada's first Prime Minister. This, of course, following that protest. We know that police are investigating. They are reviewing security footage today, as well as CCTV footage, but it's unclear who is responsible because, as you mentioned, the group that organized the demonstration before this and the march before this declined to comment on whether they knew this was going to happen, whether this was part of their demonstration. In fact, what we do know is a leaflet was circulated right before the statue toppled, talking about why they were doing this and saying that this is in response to the mayor of Montreal's refusal to have the statue taken down, despite an online petition of more than 46,000 signatures. So as you can imagine, people very upset about this, but interesting, the part of the petition, Michael, really was about Macdonald's role with Indigenous communities, how that all played out, as well as his role in the residential school system. So lots coming out of this morning.
Oh, and you mentioned some of the early reaction. Let's talk a bit more about that. What exactly are you hearing right now? Well,
we heard from Quebec's Premier today, Francois Legault, about this. Take a look at this. He went to Twitter to talk about it. In it, he said, "Whatever one might think of John A. Macdonald, destroying a monument in this way is unacceptable." He continues to say we must fight racism, but destroying parts of our history is not the solution, adding that vandalism has no place in our democracy and the statue must be restored. Now, we also heard from Alberta's Premier Jason Kenney, who reached out to his Quebec counterparts to say, listen, if Quebec doesn't want the statue, we do. That's what he wrote on Twitter. You can see it there on your screen. We're also hearing from the federal Conservative leader, Aaron O'Toole. He took to Twitter. Take a look at what he had to say about all of this. He said, "Canada wouldn't exist without Sir John A. Macdonald. Canada is a great country and one we should be proud of. We will not build a better future by defacing our past. It's time politicians grow a backbone and stand up for our country." Now, important to note, Michael, we have not heard any reaction from the Prime Minister, but that is something we are watching today.
Natalie, thank you. Well, let's continue this conversation and bring to the program Melanie Newton. She's an associate professor of history specializing in slavery and slave emancipation at the University of Toronto. And she joins us right now on the line from Toronto. So, Professor Newton, thank you for joining us.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for having me. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Listen, I'd like to begin with your reaction to the toppling of the statue. What do you think about that?
Well, I think that the fact that this happened is a symptom of a deeper issue, which is that since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and specifically since George Floyd's killing in June, governments at all levels of governments in Canada have issued platitudes about being opposed to institutional racism, but have not taken really serious leadership on thinking through how we address this issue. There's been no call for a real national conversation. There's been no concerted institutional effort to have a conversation about these monuments and to think about how we might address this fact. And it also does reflect, I think, deeper anger on the part of ordinary people that there hasn't been that kind of leadership. And when governments fail to take that kind of moral leadership, then people will fill that void. And I think it's deeply disappointing that in the lead up to my interview here, where you read some of the responses from leaders, that the claim that it's a higher level of moral leadership to, quote unquote, defend the country and to sort of go there without really addressing in the public statement the issues that the demonstration was actually about, and to recognize the tearing down of the statue as the fact that people are doing this in the absence of governments, the government levels of government in Canada themselves, actually really saying we take this seriously and we are going to address it. That really hasn't happened.
Okay, let me jump in there, though, because you say issues, and let's talk about that. Many Canadians will see this. They get offended by the pulling down of the statue. They see it as an affront to Canadian history, an affront to this country's first Prime Minister, a key architect of Confederation. So tell us a bit more. Tell us a bit more about why so many people take issue with celebrating Sir John A. and all that he did with the statue.
So all that he did is not only about being the first Prime Minister of the country and the architect of Confederation. He was also the architect of the residential school system. He was the key figure in power, as I think his title was the Superintendent General of Indian Affairs at the time of the creation of the residential school system, and he was its main political force. So he's not just, we can't just pick and choose which part of someone's legacy matters. And we also have to recognize that it is part of a democratic process to rethink what a legacy is, and to recognize and accept when someone's legacy includes authoritarianism, racism, violence, and genocide. It is recognized now that the residential school system was a form of cultural genocide, and it is wrong for political leaders to continue to promote just one part of his legacy, and also to promote an idea of this country that is tied only to that legacy. It's this sort of failure to recognize that it is a healthy part of democracy to reckon with the past in a meaningful way, and particularly to reckon with aspects of that past that continue to disempower people in the present. So it's disappointing that political leaders would respond in this way. And
but I think sorry to interrupt, but I think part of the challenge has to do with preserving Canadian pride, and also some make the argument Canadian unity. For example, how can a country so many disparate parts together without having something in common to celebrate, like a first Prime Minister? What do you say to that type of argument?
I would say that we have to think that our democracy is not so fragile, that it needs these kinds of simple, facile sort of symbols as a means of holding the country together. That's not what holds the country together. It is having robust conversations about democracy, commitments to equality, the idea that the country is stronger when everyone in it is respected, when everyone in it can participate in institutional life on an equal basis. That is the basis of strength. That other idea that you need these symbols, particularly as people whose vision of the country was one that was rooted on race and property, that is the idea that is what makes a country strong, I think is actually quite sad, and it reflects the fact that in our education system at all levels, people are not taught these richer and more complex ways of understanding the past that would help to promote really healthy relationships between citizens in the present. A state can't choose to simply support a narrative of history that oppresses a significant part of its citizenry. That is not a strong basis for a democratic present.
Melanie Newton, thank you for the time. I appreciate it.